Marxist scholarship on issues to do with the structure of capitalism, its history, and where it was headed to. In particular, the agrarian question, the debate around it focused on the formation of the distinctive classes of the capitalist mode of production, that is the proletariat, masses of working people, and the capitalist class. Of course, there are other classes as well. In both urban contexts, of course, capitalism came into being initially in relatively small-scale societies, but by the time industrialization was beginning in England in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was associated with industrial development. But also the agrarian question deals with classes in rural contexts. So there are three dimensions to the classical agrarian question. One is the question of politics. I'll put that first and foremost. It's a question of class alliances. Alliances of capital, different kinds, but also alliances of the rural masses, the peasantry, and emerging proletarian classes. So there's a contested politics of what the role of agriculture is in these transitions. There's also, that's sometimes called agrarian question one. Agrarian question two is around production. It's around the creation of the investment and improvement in the forces of production, partly in order, of course, to create a surplus to feed an emerging urban proletariat, but with other connections to this emerging capitalist economy. Agrarian question three is in part the contribution of agriculture to the development of these societies that were undergoing this transition more generally. It was the problematic of accumulation and the use of a surplus produced in the rural economy for purposes of industrialization, either through taxation and then reinvestment via the state, but also through creating a market for manufactured goods. So these three problematics are closely interwoven with one another. And the literature on these issues suggests that there's a great diversity of pathways, of ways of engaging with these questions in transitions. There's not one pathway. The classical transition in England, theorized by Marx, and Das Kapital, is not replicated elsewhere. And of course, there's also a great many different takes on this question. There's a diversity of viewpoints. It's not as though there's an established dogma around these questions. It's an issue alive with controversy and debate. So, three questions for the agrarian question in the 21st century and in Africa. Is this classical way of posing the agrarian question still relevant today, given globalization, given the dominance of capitalist relations across the world, given the shift of large sectors of the global population away from the countryside to urban areas and the relatively small place of agriculture in wider economies? Is the agrarian question still relevant at all? One answer to that question, provided by Henry Bernstein, very controversial, was that from the point of view of capital, the agrarian question is resolved, but from the point of view of classes of labor, it is not resolved as yet. In other words, he split the agrarian question into these two components. That's controversial. I wonder what our speakers have to say about that. Secondly, is there a distinctive southern perspective on the agrarian question, or even a distinctive African perspective, given the fact that parts of the world are not equal, and that we have to take the combined and uneven development of capitalism crucially into account? Are these is the classical version northern-centric? And is it misleading as a result? So I think they will address that question as well. And thirdly, and often this didn't form part of the classical question at all, where is the ecological dimension? We live in a world in which sustainability of our living on the planet is in question. What does the rethinking the agrarian question have to say about that issue? So that's all I'm going to say by way of setting the scene. And we're now going to have our three speakers, one after another, for 15 minutes each, offering their thoughts. So get ready for the debate which will follow, jotting down your own thoughts and questions. Those can be questions of clarity, but they can also be arguments that you yourself want to make. Right. Okay, so let's have our first speaker, Professor Kojo Amano from University of Ghana.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now, in looking at this question of the agrarian question in West Africa, I will look at it historically, since it's essentially about the nature of agrarian change. And I look at the three major periods of accumulation, agrarian accumulation in West Africa. So West Africa has a very long history of integration into international agricultural production, into export crop production, which goes back to the early 19th century, yeah. So by 1820s, oil palm became a major export from West Africa into Germany, UK, and France. And this was followed by cocoa, groundnuts in the Senegambia and northern Nigeria, and cotton. Yeah. All of these developed in the 19th century. Forms of commodification of land also developed in the 19th century. From early 19th century, there were land sales on the Gold Coast, and land was being sold in Lagos from the 1860s. So before colonialism, West Africa was integrated into forms of agricultural production for industries. Yeah. And these forms of production were complex. They were not based on simple communities, but they often involved hierarchical relationships and migrations, large migrations. Yeah. So there were migrations from the Sahelian region into the coastal regions, which were the main export producing zones. And within the northern Nigeria, there was a reproduction of a peasantry without ownership of land, which produced surplus for a land-owning class. So this formed the basis of indirect rule in West Africa, which emerged in West Africa, and which was based on these forms of peasant production, yeah, and the hierarchical accumulation within peasant production. So under indirect rule, peasant production was considered the most efficient and cheap forms of production, and and there was an attempt to maintain an independent peasantry and prevent its erosion by European capital in plantations. So the main European forces, the main agricultural forces investing in agricultural plantations focused on the Congo and Central West Africa rather than West Africa. But while the base was dominated by peasant production. The marketing of crops was dominated by consolidation of European companies. And by the 30s, 40s, there were three companies which dominated the whole of marketing in West Africa, of which one was UAC, CFAO, and SCOA. Yeah. And there were large labor markets which were highly mobile. Whilst there was a significant expansion of export crop production, the disadvantage of this was twofold. Firstly, there was little development of science and technology in this period. Yeah. So the first developments of a scientific infrastructure and experimental research stations started in the 1950s. And before that, production was largely controlled by an alliance of colonial administration with chiefs who established bylaws. And this encouraged considerable discontent among, which was manifest in boycotts within the cocoa industry, but also went into the anti-colonial struggle in many areas which had strong peasant basis here. And so by the end of the colonial period, this base was quite fragile, and attempts were created to transform it, to develop a new approach. Yeah. But this didn't really develop until the independence period. The other major consequence of this focus on export crops was increasing importation of foods to meet the needs of the urban sector, particularly of export of oils. Yeah. So the first initiatives in modern large-scale productions were focused on addressing this concern, developing groundnuts, oil palm, and then cereal crops as a method of addressing the food question. And this continued through the early independence period, which was essentially a period of experimentation in developing a new agrarian base based on promoting agro-industries. And this drew from a number of sources. It drew from American models of modernization, but it also drew from Soviet experimentations in state farms, cooperatives, yeah. And this formed the basis of an attempt to create an agri-industrial base within the 60s, yeah. So, two forms of agrarian accumulation developed in this period. The first was state investments in agriculture and state linkages with the peasantry through forms of state farms, cooperative. The second characteristic was the nurturing of a class of agrarian capitalists supported by state loans and access to land and subsidized inputs. And the third base was to continue the existing export crop production zones which produced the main sources of revenues. So these new forms of agriculture were not established by expropriating the peasantries within the major export producing zones, but establishing new frontier zones of agricultural modernization, often in the transition zones, which were not highly populated, establishing the beginnings of irrigation infrastructures. And promoting new areas of peasant agricultural production, using modern inputs, providing tractor services, and so this continued through the 60s and 70s in still an experimental form. And during the 70s, there were several problems in this production, which partly related to the world food crisis and the world energy crisis, which resulted in increasing costs of fertilizers, but also to the Sahelian drought of the 1970s, and erratic weather conditions and drought, which often resulted in bankruptcy for commercial farmers. And this phase of development came to an end by the 1980s, where there were major transformations in agribusiness, in world production, and imposition of structural adjustment, which opened up African societies to external investments. So since then, the major forms of accumulation have resulted in the decline of state investments in agriculture and their replacement by agribusiness. But in most cases, this does not address the question of national agricultural research capacity building, because the research capacities of these agribusiness companies are not nationally rooted. And secondly, the decline of the whole agri-industrial sector does not produce a diverse agricultural sector which can address the employment needs of workers and youth, and provide sufficient support for creating a diverse agricultural economy. So the agricultural economy becomes defined by sectors in which agribusiness is interested in investing. And the major developments of this have been in establishing new forms of governance in which agribusiness controls, through relationships with states, but with NGOs and farmers' associations, controls are established over these production patterns for export crop production. The second, in recent years, the second phase has included a focus now on encouraging increased use of inputs and new seeds and investments in developing food production for local markets. The question whether this addresses the food, it's debatable whether this addresses the food question, because this occurs among increasing expansion of food imports, particularly of rice and other staples. And these developments are leading to increasing consumption of inputs by peasant farmers, which provides sources of markets for agribusiness. And often these new forms of agricultural economy are based on intensive technologies, use of mechanized inputs, herbicides, all of which have impacts on the environment. But because the state plays a peripheral role in agricultural production, the monitoring of these developments is questionable, often leading to new forms of land degradation. So the dominant agrarian forms increasing domination of the economy by agribusiness. And agribusiness essentially producing for external markets or bringing in inputs, extending input markets, which is often labeled as pro-poor development. But whether it's development for the rural poor or it's development for agribusiness is a big question. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kojo. Yeah, so a very rich presentation, and I think you're emphasizing the increasing dominance of agribusiness. So that's, in a way, reframing the agrarian question. But perhaps we'll come back to other remarks, to pulling out the chief thrust of the argument, building on that rich empirical presentation. Next presentation, Professor Ruth Hall from Plaas on Southern Africa.
Hello, everyone. In stark contrast to West Africa, in Southern Africa there was mass expropriation of land from the peasantry in a racialized process that means that the agrarian question not only embodies a land question but also a national question and a question of what post-coloniality looks like. In Southern Africa we have these two distinct zones created. The settler colonies, where there was substantial land dispossession to make way for large-scale industrial forms of agriculture, capitalist agriculture by a white minority, alongside labor reserves. So the distinction that I would draw between the West African context that Kojo has outlined and the Southern African reality is the creation of agrarian dualism that has particular challenges for how we think of the agrarian question. And this dualism between capitalist agriculture on the one hand and peasant agriculture located within the labor reserves or tribal areas of Southern Africa was based not only on the accumulation of capital through agriculture, but particularly the production of landless working class that could be absorbed as cheap labor into mining. And I think that that is a particular feature of the Southern African context. Two key processes that I want to draw attention to that have marked Southern Africa but equally other parts of the continent. The first is a long-term process of de-agrarianization. So structural adjustment following the oil crisis of the 1970s contributed to declines in smallholder agriculture, often pushing rural out-migration. And we saw a stark contrast between countries that were oil-rich and those plunged into debt. Prescriptions from international financial institutions forced the dismantling of national subsidies for farmers, the marketing boards, combined with trade liberalization through the 80s and 90s. And these really hit the commercial crops that were the mainstay of smallholder and peasant farmers, from tea and coffee to cotton and tobacco. And we see this across much of Southern Africa and beyond. So many scholars have investigated what have been the outcomes, emphasizing that these were differentiated, with commodity production declining and migration rising, and often shifts within households with gender and generational relations changing. One outcome has been the phenomenon of older women left behind in the rural areas, a familiar pattern to us, those of us in southern Africa, who have the remnants of the native reserves, now the customary or communal lands, which serve this function of providing social protection to people migrating out, but still providing a link into an agrarian livelihood and a link to the land, often via women's smallholder production. So despite these transformations, I think it's important to remember that Africa still has 33 million family farms of less than 2 hectares. And these account for 80% of all farms in Africa. So even though there's been this restructuring, in fact, family farms remain dominant numerically. Yet, we see a persistent and chronic neglect of smallholder agriculture by state institutions across most of southern Africa and other parts of the continent. The policy responses from our governments and multilateral agencies have been orthodox. If we look at the African Union, NEPAD and others, they focus almost exclusively on increasing the productivity and efficiency of agriculture with limited attention to questions of who will benefit and who will lose out. In contrast, alternative perspectives tend to look at de-agrarianization and growing landlessness as profound policy challenges. The second process I want to focus on is land grabbing. Now, we've noted in work that we at CLASS have done the long-term crisis of agriculture, the failure of agrarian transitions, and how these have produced food insecurity, dependence on food imports, rampant rural to urban migration, and unemployment. And also the fact that there's been chronic underinvestment in rural infrastructure as there's been a decline in state revenues. And it's in this context that African states have welcomed foreign investors, often on preferential terms, and sometimes provided them even with cheap or free vast tracts of land, both to foreign governments, to corporations, and to individuals. Now, 10 years ago, in 2009, the World Bank published a significant report about African agriculture, and it was called Awakening Africa's Sleeping Giant. It promoted a discourse of Africa as the new global investment frontier, as the world's last vast unutilized land resource. With projections of world population rising to 9 billion by 2050, and also the dietary changes in some parts of the world associated with rising incomes, it was estimated by world leaders that there would need to be a doubling of food production globally by 2050. International finance and development institutions argued that this vast open land in Africa, land that was portrayed as empty, would be key to meeting global food needs, and it advocated the commercialization of African agriculture. So Africa, the most food insecure continent, would need to feed the world. And to make way for this to happen, smallholder agriculture would need to be squeezed. But we have interrogated these narratives of scarcity and the ways in which they operate to deflect from local realities, and they focus only on aggregate global food supply. In fact, some of these narratives of scarcity serve to justify the redistribution of scarcities from elsewhere in the world to African localities. In the period between 2009 and 2011, there was an unprecedented phase of large-scale land-based investments globally, but 70% of these were in Africa, and specifically in sub-Saharan Africa. So in many respects, African states are finally getting what they for a long time sought, foreign direct investment, but on terms and in forms that are profoundly problematic and have been likened to a new scramble for African farmland. So what does all this mean for the agrarian question in Africa? Firstly, I would argue it does mean that we've seen a new process of accumulation by dispossession, a new era of primitive accumulation in Africa. Why? Partly because of a failure to resolve land questions and the ongoing legal and political neglect of customary and informal land rights that dominate the continent. As a result, we've seen displacement and resettlement of large populations of people, with differential outcomes, some benefiting and others losing out. And more importantly, I think, a loss of common property resources, particularly affecting women, who often rely on resources like forests and rivers, but also populations like pastoralists. This has also seen the creation of new rural wage labor markets, but also incomplete processes of proletarianization. So 3 reflections on this land grabbing phenomenon. Firstly, these new enclosures in Africa of the African commons have been seen as reminiscent of the European enclosures of the past few centuries and the English enclosures up to the early 19th century, in that they saw the appropriation of small holdings and common lands for private benefit in larger holdings, a process that has expelled people from land-based livelihoods. The key difference is this: there is no industrial revolution underway in Africa to absorb the surplus populations that are expelled from the land. And so we see the growth of landless or near landless populations. A second point is that in Africa, unlike in Asia and Latin America, many of these large-scale investments have foundered, they have failed in the absence of substantial state subsidies, which in the past were used to support the emergence of commercial agriculture in the colonial and post-colonial eras. If one thinks, for instance, of the ways in which the apartheid government subsidized the creation of white capitalist agriculture. So in many ways, African states have looked to investors to provide public goods, like, for instance, rural road networks, social infrastructure like schools and clinics that have previously been the preserve of states, but in many respects that has failed to materialize. A third point about this land-grabbing phenomenon is that although it's largely based on the leasehold model of 15, 50, even 99 years, in practice what we're seeing is customary land being lost in perpetuity, often associated with irreversible changes in land uses and landscapes, as family farming gives way to industrial-scale monocropping. So let me just continue by thinking about how we connect this with the long-term debates about large versus small farm growth trajectories in Africa and their implications for the changing dynamics of the African farming sector. So I would argue that there are different pathways that we see unfolding across the continent, including in southern Africa. And we need to understand these different pathways and think about their implications. And we've conducted research on different pathways and different scales of agriculture, focusing on Ghana, Kenya, and Zambia, and I'd like to share some findings with you. First of all, the land grab has seen the rise, or indeed the revival, of the big farm model in Africa. So this recent resurgence in big plantations and industrial estates mimics, and in some cases literally revives, large colonial estates and state farms that were the hallmark of post-colonial developmentalism in the early independence period. So while these dramatic changes are happening in landholding, not all of them are entirely new. Some of them resurrect old forms of large-scale production associated with the early part of the and mid-part of the 20th centuries. And in some cases, we even see that big foreign investments are actually taking over what used to be state farms under national governments and previously colonial estates. So we're seeing a revival of this old model. Secondly, first of all, I want to say about the plantation model, that one of the arguments is that it creates a dynamic of production that is relatively enclavic, which is that it buys inputs from far away, often foreign-denominated US dollar inputs for production, and similarly sells into global value chains, often with very weak linkages into local economies. The second dynamic, in addition to the big farms on plantations, is that while pro-smallholder policies have been largely neglected, contract farming is on the rise again, particularly in southern Africa. And contract farming by smallholders linked into industrial value chains is often seen as an alternative to corporate land grabbing. In other words, leave the smallholders on their own land. They can control it using their own labor, but they will sell into globally linked commercial value chains. And this is presented as an inclusive business model that on the one hand has the benefits of no land dispossession, on the other hand opening opportunities for accumulation to smallholders. And we see the expansion of this in the sugarcane sector in southern Africa, where South African companies are now expanding across many other neighboring countries. We also see it with new forms of inclusion of smallholders, for instance, in Zimbabwe, post-fast track becoming outgrowers in tobacco. But elsewhere we see it in vegetables and fruit. And what we found about the outgrower model is that there are some positive effects of the outgrower model in terms of creating livelihoods for smallholders. But we see different outcomes for different people. Some are managing to accumulate, while others are proletarianizing. And some people are able to secure their access to food better through loose contracts rather than through these tightly integrated contracts with international companies. But the big story across the continent and including in southern Africa is in fact not the big corporate and foreign-driven plantations and estates, nor the smallholder contract farming, but another kind of agricultural commercialization, and that is the rise of middle farmers. So medium-scale farmers, defined as between 10 and 100 hectares, those who hold those kinds of land holdings, now account for a growing proportion of land holdings across many parts of the continent. For instance, 20% in Kenya, 32% in Ghana, 39% in Tanzania, and over 50% in Zambia. So something interesting is happening in terms of class relations, where smallholders are being squeezed, big plantations and estates are being established through deals between often international investors and governments or traditional authorities. But we actually are seeing the rise of domestic elites and medium-scale farmers. So rather than the idea of a sectoral transition where surpluses from a commercializing capitalist agricultural class are reinvested, and that's how commercialization proceeds, in fact we see the opposite. Because who are these medium-scale farmers? Many of them are from outside of agriculture. These are retired civil servants, business people, bringing surpluses acquired from urban sectors and other sectors of the economy and investing them into agriculture. And we looked at, for instance, middle farmers in Ghana involved with tropical fruit export, Kenya involved with coffee production for global markets, and in Zambia, grain producers. And what's interesting about these middle farmers is that they have a very different set of connections into local economies from the big plantations and compared to the smallholder farmers. They have much more strong local economic linkages. They're buying from local markets, they're employing labor, and they're selling into local markets as well. I think we should be asking a lot more questions about the significance and potential long-term implications of the rise of these medium-scale farmers. Partly because in areas where they predominate, they actually have a very similar effect on land displacement that the big land deals have. So cumulatively, relatively medium-scale farms dominating an area can similarly lead to landlessness and dispossession of local people. And I see this in southern Africa, for instance, with the growth of emerging new elites in Zimbabwe, in parts of Zambia, in Mozambique, and of course in Namibia there's the big story about the medium-scale farmers is not in crop production but livestock and the growth of illegal fencing in the communal areas there. So I'm going to preserve some of my time later to identify some of the dimensions of the agrarian question that I think need more attention. But I want to close now with two reflections so far. One is that while we have land grabbing or sort of accumulation from above by big multinational companies, but also domestic elites, and the creation of the large farm model, as well as the rise of medium-scale farmers, there is also accumulation from below happening in some places where dynamic smallholders are actively engaged with markets and engaging in some form of reproduction. In conclusion, two reflections on the region. One is the argument by Samir Amin, who a while ago argued, the late Samir Amin, who said that our ongoing efforts to integrate the peasantry in the South into monopoly-controlled global agro-food systems can only produce mass marginalization and pauperization. So I think that we need to think about whether that is the case in our respective regions. And the second reflection I have is that while we might think of Southern Africa as being very different from other parts of the continent, and particularly the agrarian structure in South Africa as being very different, what I think this new phase of enclosure and commercialization might mean is that in parts of the continent, countries that have no history of settler colonialism are starting to develop features of agrarian dualism. In other words, there are zones of large-scale capitalist agriculture emerging alongside pockets of landlessness. And so forms of inequality that are the hallmark of the agrarian structure in South Africa and in other parts of Southern Africa are starting to emerge elsewhere. So for instance, in countries that have seen nationalization of land after independence, say Mozambique, Tanzania, we start to see the emergence of these two countrysides. Agrarian dualism is actually on the move in Africa. And I think that if we really think about what we've learned about agrarian dualism and its implications for poverty and inequality in South Africa, we should cast a critical eye about the implications of this across the region. So the commercialization that we see underway in Africa is recreating some kinds of agrarian dualism that we associate with settler colonies and which are imprinted obviously in South Africa, in Namibia, and previously also very much in Zimbabwe prior to fast-track land reform. And this has raised the question about whether these new phases of land dispossession and the concentration of land holdings will in the future drive land-related conflicts, and also whether there will be emerging new political demands for the redistribution of land elsewhere in the future. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ruth. Okay, our third and final speaker, Professor Isa Shibji from Tanzania. Isa.
I was asking Ruth whether I needed to speak after they were spoken. Coming from a theoretical workshop, I'm not going to speak about East Africa. Kojo and Ruth have done it. I'll speak more about theory. I know these days with the changes on the way we produce and talk about knowledge, theory is de-emphasized. It's empirical research and policy research and concepts, none of which requires theory, is in fashion. But I would like particularly our younger people to read Amilcar Cabral, Weapon of Theory, to appreciate the importance of theory. When Cabral was once challenged, he said, I have seen many revolutions in my life, but I have to see a single successful revolution without revolutionary theory. And that is the importance of theory. In his introduction, Professor Kazim rightly characterized the agrarian question as a key question facing us in Africa today. And in addressing that question, we are looking for keys which will unlock the locks which have locked us in locked us into this worldwide capitalist system with incessant hunger and thirst for accumulation and ridden with crisis. This is a system which politically, in terms of its manifestation in our part of the world, we used to call imperialism. I know that word is no longer fashionable. Even the left scholars shy away from using the term, but I will not. If you have heard Professor Amanor, Professor Hall carefully, how do you describe that except imperialism? So I think that is what is before us, and that is what we have to address. Now, at the outset, let me make 3 points. One is a great question in Africa, in my view, cannot be addressed outside the logic of worldwide capitalist system, which today in its neoliberal phase is characterized by 2 things. One, dominance of monopoly capital, and 2, financialized monopoly capital. Financialization is actually a very specific feature of neoliberalism. And this financialization is not the same type of finance capital that Lenin talked about. It's a different type of financialization. I'm not going to details of it, but please read up on that. And though I think these 2 important interrelated characteristics of present system of capitalism we are locked into. 2, needless to repeat, and yet it's important to repeat, that the heart of the capitalist mode of production is accumulation. Accumulate, accumulate. That is the Moses and the prophets, Marx said. And that is the driving force of capitalism. Therefore, to understand our systems, even we want to understand the great question, we have to understand the form and character of accumulation, which would help us to characterize our social formations and its specificities. By now, you heard that there are 2 forms, broadly speaking, of capital accumulation. One which classically was called primitive accumulation by Marx, meaning the original accumulation of capital in the historical development of capitalism. Because nature did not create 2 groups of people, one with capital, other without capital. They came to possess this capital historically, and the original possession of capital was primitive accumulation. And Africa was totally imbricated in this process of primitive accumulation. The most devastating integration of Africa into this primitive accumulation of capital was, of course, the slave trade, which no other continent has ever seen, with devastating effects, from which we are suffering to this day. The second form of accumulation is accumulation by expanded reproduction. That is to say, to put it simply, capital invests in land, in machinery and so on, employs labor, and at the end produces commodities which are sold, and the surplus is made, and with that surplus then you start the second cycle with expansion. Okay? This is accumulation by expanded reproduction, which is the classical capitalist accumulation that Marx described. I want to argue that we have to extend the classical meaning of primitive accumulation as original accumulation in two ways. One, in its meaning, and two, in its temporal existence. For Marx, primitive accumulation stopped and then began the expanded reproduction. As you know, letter writers question this, like Rosa Luxemburg. Primitive accumulation continues. It is in existence to this day, and it still continues. And it has taken many new forms, okay, which of course we need to investigate. Not simply the classical form of enclosures and so on, but the new forms of so-called primitive accumulation. And two, I would like to suggest a new definition of primitive accumulation, besides the classical one. There is an important aspect of primitive accumulation in our present era, and throughout the colonial period and the rest, was that capital cuts into necessary consumption of the producer, of labor. You remember that in Marx's theory, capital pays to the labor sufficient, the value of labor, sufficient to reproduce itself. So to come back the next day, to come to work, and also reproduce the family, so that more workers are created. I am suggesting that in our case, capital does not pay the value of labor for it to reproduce itself. It cuts into necessary consumption, which is necessary for labor to reproduce itself. And that is how it extracts more surplus out of labor. Whether this labor is peasant labor, is working class labor, or is labor in informal sectors. This is a defining characteristic, and I call it primitive accumulation. Cutting into necessary consumption. Which means what? Which means that on the side of capital, we have a crisis of accumulation. I'm talking about, of course, in our countries. And on the side of labor producer, you have the crisis of social reproduction. Okay. Which we give a flippant name called poverty. It's really crisis of reproduction. Because for labor, take for example peasant, to be able to survive and exist, has to exert superhuman effort to be able to have just subhuman lives. Go to villages anywhere in Africa and you will see the peasant. In this case, the peasant is largely woman, by the way. In many places in Africa, the peasant is a woman. The real peasant is the woman. The amount of labor they put in. And the woman labor is not only put in production, but also in reproduction. One need to be able to survive. There are many other forms of cutting-edge necessary consumption I will not go into. So in a way, labor is subsidizing capital. Labor is subsidizing capital. Because the burden of shouldering reproduction is now on labor, not on capital. The third point I want to make is that a great question in the present era is essentially the peasant question. In Africa, the great question today is really the peasant question. And by peasant, I mean in both its meanings. Peasants who live on land and survive on land are involved in production, and the peasants whose land has been expropriated, will be the landless peasants. And I would add, and this requires much greater discussion, but I'm glad that Ruth mentioned it, that simultaneously, the present question is also a national question in Africa. The national question. Immediately after independence, in various ways, the first generation nationalists tried to address the national question. They did not succeed. With the neoliberalist attack, the national question was simply put aside, did not feature at all. We are back integrated into new forms of, worse forms in many ways, of so-called colonialism, which Nkrumah had long ago called neo-colonialism. You know about your country more than I do, so I would not like to. You're very, very slippery grounds. But unlike, of course, the rest of Africa, or much of the rest of Africa, I think South Africa had never that period of nationalism after independence. They were born into neoliberalism straight away. So their nationalist period was a national liberation struggle, really, which was aborted. And if I would not be surprised that you also get many, there's already scholars writing that there's no national question in South Africa, the way they are saying there's no agrarian question in South Africa. There's a national question, but I'm not so sure. But that is something that for you to discuss and debate. Now, how does this presentation that I've made, in very short telegraphic messages, differ from the classical presentation of the agrarian question? I think Ben has summarized it quite well of what was the classical agrarian question. From Kautsky through Lenin, to many writers today in the Marxist tradition of the agrarian question, see the agrarian question essentially as a question of transition, from feudal, semi-feudal, peasant, pre-capitalist mode of production to capitalist mode of production. In which, put it simply, the peasantry disappears and reincarnates itself as the proletariat in industries. And agriculture itself is industrialized, what we call capitalist agriculture. This was the classical presentation. In land there is some nuance, political nuance. Our worker presents the lands. But the man did not live long enough to develop that. But again, the present question I think is most developed in Mao and in China. Okay. Now there are two components of the agrarian question for our purposes. There is the land question and there is the question of small production or even large production, depending on where you are. Land question resolves itself into two forms of production on land: large-scale agriculture, which during colonial times were the settled agriculture where massive land was alienated, like Southern Africa, I just talked about it. In some of the African countries, plantation sector, there also there was alienation, but not on the same scale, but there was. And post-colonial large-scale agriculture, whose manifestation we have seen more recently with land grabbing, re-establishing kind of plantations in different way, whether it's a biofuel, sugar, or whatever. And then there's small-scale present production, which exists side by side, but not quite in a sense dualist. You know, they are not separate, of course. There's such a relationship between the two, which we have to tease out. In some countries in Africa, still, it is the peasant production, small peasant production, which dominates, and predominates. So in our situation, the land reform presents itself in two forms. One, where there is large-scale agriculture, like set agriculture, where land was alienated. Fundamentally, land reform means land redistribution. It means land redistribution. Now I know this is a very controversial subject, particularly in South Africa. We are in efficient agriculture, productivity will go down, etc., etc. I'm not going to that. But for me, land redistribution is an unresolved question even in South Africa. People fought for land and freedom. People fought for land and freedom. They have not got their land. I don't know if they got freedom. Because I don't know if you can have freedom without land. In Kenya, to this day, there's the same issue. There's the same issue. So it remains an important question. And maybe it will resurrect itself in other African countries with this large corporate grabbing of land. And so far as the small producer is concerned, the small producer. And the big debate in this area is that you give security to the system by the process of ITR, individualization, titling, and registration of land. And that's a big debate. Suppose you give security to the small producer. But in fact, what it does is it makes land negotiable. So easily, makes it much more easy for the powerful to alienate land, to buy their titles from the people in distress, etc., etc. As alternative, and I must wind up because Ben has already showed me the red card. As alternative, some scholars, some African scholars have argued that in our situation we have to possibly see a peasant path of development. Peasant path of development. And there are two things about this. One, let's assume on land distribution, okay, immediately differentiation sets in. In any commodity producing society, there will be differentiation, okay, or what is known as accumulation from below. But we find invariably the rich peasantry which develop and so on, or even the middle peasantry, is captured by agri-business. This happened in Zimbabwe after redistribution. It's an ongoing process. And therefore, the process of redistribution is reversed in a different form. Even in other countries with small peasant production, you find the difference that takes place given the overall system which is dominated by monopoly capital. The rich peasantry becomes compradorized. Instead of accumulating capital, it takes surplus out of agriculture into other areas of business which give you quick returns. Before I wind up, with your permission, 2 or 3 minutes, there is, both cousins mentioned and I think Ruth touched on, there is this question that some scholars have posited, which they said that first they divide agrarian question into agrarian question of capital and agrarian question of labor. Okay? And they say, for example, in the case of South Africa, the agrarian question of capital has been resolved. Why? Because your capitalist agriculture. What you're left with is agriculture question of labor. Because your surplus labor, it is not absorbed into industry. It's not fully proletarianized. So the process remains incomplete. I have a problem with this. I think it's problematic for 3 or 4 reasons. One, it sees the agrarian question in Africa today through the lenses of what is supposed to have happened in Europe, particularly in England. Abstracting from the worldwide process of accumulation. Abstracting from the worldwide process of accumulation. So you can separate capital and labor. You only see the local capital, but you don't see that this local, so-called local capital, how is it linked with the worldwide accumulation process, worldwide capital. Because if you saw that, then you would not say that it has been resolved. My view, it has not been resolved. Neither the question of capital nor the question of labor has been resolved. Secondly, as I already said, you separate the two. Thirdly, and I think this is important, you say that surplus is not absorbed. Assumption being the surplus population that was produced in England, for example, by enclosures was absorbed into industries. Right? Now, two problems with that. Through industrial revolution. I have two problems with it. First, recent writings have shown, particularly from the scholars from the South, Samir Amin, Utsa Patnaik, Prabhat Patnaik, that actually the dominant traditional narrative, even by Marxists, was not correct. The surplus labor was not totally absorbed. Significant portion of it was actually exported to new lands, US, Australia, New Zealand, of course Africa and other colonies, etc. So not all surplus labor was absorbed. They exported as a surplus labor, in the past they also exported their problems to us, from which we are suffering to this day. Secondly, the Industrial Revolution was not a result of total internal accumulation. Long ago, many years ago, Eric Williams, in a marvelous book called Capital and Slavery, showed that in fact slave labor, primitive accumulation, had a big contribution to make to Industrial Revolution. That's where the capital came from. The capital came from slaves. The capital came from treasures that were looted in what we now call United States. By the way, I don't know whether it's acceptable to say against this, because in the US, there was the first genocide committed, right? Talk about genocide, we forget the first genocide committed in the US. The local population totally killed and devastated. So, this is what contributed to Industrial Revolution. So both counts. It seems to me one cannot say that the Agrarian question has been resolved. Now, I have pointed out some of the problems, also for present path of development. If you were to envisage a possible alternative, then I think you have to go further. And again, scholars from the South have discussed this a lot, that we need to de-link from imperialism. That doesn't mean you become autarky. Of course, you're living in the world. But what it does mean is submit your internal accumulation. You follow the logic of internal accumulation. And you don't submit to the logic of external accumulation or center-periphery system, the capitalist system. That's what is meant by national autonomous development. We should think more about it. And then within that, you situate the resolution of the agrarian question. And therefore, people have posited, taking examples from other countries, learning from them, that after redistribution and with present property, of course, a series of steps for some kind of collective property, maybe passing through various stages like cooperatives and so on and so forth. This is the kind of debate which is going on in Africa, which of course you don't see much in the dominant literature. What you see in the dominant literature, commercialization, etc., etc. But what are the possible alternative paths of development? Of course, all this will require, because these are political questions. So I'm glad that Ben started by saying that quintessentially it's a political question. Who will do it? I mean, who will do it? Of course, you need a certain type of agency, certain character of the state to do it, right? And that doesn't come about because you wished it. That comes about struggles, which are going on all the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Comments on each other's work until the very end. You can keep your thoughts there. So we've only got half an hour, next more like 27 minutes. So instead I'm going to open up for questions and debate. Okay, so I hope you've been formulating your questions. If you haven't, you've got another minute to do that. So I want to see you all writing down your questions, particularly on the theoretical aspects. Okay, and in the meantime, can I ask the three speakers to come up and sit on the stage? And they will field your questions, although I will direct them somewhat.
Is it promotion or demotion?
We'll see when the eggs start to rain on you. Okay, so wide-ranging and complex perspectives and debates. I just want to pick up on one place, and that's actually where Issa ended off. Are there alternative pathways of development in the contemporary world? And if so, realistically, how do we struggle for them? Okay, I think that's the overall pressing question. Everything else is, in a way, subordinate to how do we make the world a different kind of place. Is delinking from imperialism or the global system a practical possibility for African governments on their own? I'm not sure about that. Is there a peasant pathway of development, given the fact our economies are increasingly about so many other things, not about agriculture? These are important questions, so I hope we can come up with our own ideas and responses to this. Okay, so I hope people are now ready. So hands. One there, another one. Too many hands. There, another hand, and over there. Right. Okay, let's start here. If you can introduce yourself and direct a question either to all three speakers or to one of them. Have we got a mic at all? Yeah.
Oops, can I have this?
I'm Alex.
That's not working.
Hello. Hi, I'm Alex. I'm a PhD student at PLOS. I'm not sure if I'll be able to be totally coherent to my question. I should have wrote it down from the beginning. But the first one is sort of general, and then I've got a few more particular ones for Professor Shivji. The more general one is that it seems to me that it's been mentioned that the agrarian question was originally formulated as a question of transition, specifically transition to a sort of developed capitalist economy. But what seems somewhat neglected to me is that, especially amongst many of the theorists who were involved in it, that it was embedded within a broader process of theorizing the road to socialism, which that is in terms of surpassing contradictions of capitalist development. And it seems to me that that sort of thrust has been lost, that we're sort of caught within the contradictions of capitalism and have lost a sense of a greater path. And in some cases, the strengths of the agrarian question, specifically theorizing the relationship of agriculture to industrial development, get sort of bogged down into questions of particular forms, or forms of production, plantations, or outgrowers, being surprised at issues of differentiation when that's exactly what we would anticipate. There are issues that were not adequately theorized. For instance, the focus on Russia's specific transition sort of led to an internalist problematic that neglected the world market, and as all the speakers have noted, AFTA has always been deeply embedded in these systems. But it seems to me that that when we apply the agrarian question today, we tend to focus on these things and sort of get caught into them in problematic ways. So, for instance, with Professor Shivji's formulation of things like the poverty or underdevelopment or despair when the crises of social reproduction of an African peasantry, that they're necessarily being super exploited, and that it's perfectly reasonable to presume whether or not imperialism or monopolist practices are indeed occurring, that comes as a condition of the development of the productive forces in capitalism more generally. Similarly it seems to me that when Professor Shivji, when you put forward that issues of primitive accumulation are necessarily one not whether there's dispossession occurring, but one of whether there was a transition to capitalism or not. And world-class capitalism being firmly developed now seems to be the issue about whether it can be characterized as primitive. But I think all these sort of sub-issues, to my mind, get to the point of how do we envision agriculture contributing to some sort of transition. In the absence of that, we might be putting too much on it than it can possibly hope to bear. And in South Africa, that seems very evident with the land issue, where land is becoming a symbol for all kinds of, for freedom, for all sorts, for economic freedom, that it cannot hope to contain on its own. And in Africa specifically, it sort of begs the question of industrial development more broadly. And I think the countries that, even while retaining a significant number of smallholders, places like China, places like South Korea, it was the industrial question that actually led the way. And I think the agrarian question, if nothing else, teaches us to see these things together. And I feel like we might be focusing on one side rather than the other.
Thank you very much, Alex. Natalie. So we have this theoretically formed intervention there. I hope you can continue with it.
No, I think we theorize. Okay, my name is Natalie. I've just finished master's also in the land case study disposition, but I want to do my PhD on the practical side of it. So I was hoping to get the answer to the land question here. Because I think, just listening to everyone, we're not practical enough. We theorize a lot. We've got of Marxism, Stalinism, Leninism, all the isms we've looked at. But the reality is our people on the land still don't have the land back. And when they do have the land back, they don't know what to do with it. And then you have capital's intervention, and they take the land away again. So we're struggling with this. So I was hoping that the answer to my question on the land question would be, what can we do? What are those practical interventions to make the land work for the people who have been dispossessed from the land? What are the lessons that we've learned from other people who've got their land back, who've actually managed that land in such a way that we're able to do something? So hopefully I can get an answer.
Good question.
It's for you.
This side, yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm just going to try and keep it brief. First of all, thank you very much for this. My name is Siasang and I'm a master's student at IST. First of all, what I got from this discussion today is that, the agrarian question is, it has its own dynamics. It's not a simplistic question. There are things like, the domination of the agribusiness within the agrarian question, and also the dichotomy between the capitalist, farming and peasantry. But my question really is directed to Prof. Shivji. You spoke about the the significance of, or you spoke about the importance of the peasantry within this agrarian question. But my question is exactly that. I think this is also something that Peter Hode says about Fanon. That Fanon in Africa he spoke about the the importance of the peasantry within the revolution. That in Africa, as opposed to other parts of the world, that you have a fully industrialized society where you have the working class. But in opposition, there in Africa you have peasantry. But now the current reality is that even in Africa, particularly in South Africa, due to urbanization and immigration, large populations have moved from the rural areas to the urban areas. So we find out that the large population of the people are either in the urban areas or in the urban peripheries. As you can see, that there are a lot of informal settlements, meaning that most peasants moved to the urban areas. So the peasantry currently, as we speak, are the minority of the entire population. The population is in the urbanized society. So my question is, is the peasantry still capable of carrying out a revolution or a liberatory struggle that would be qualitative enough to bring about change that would be enough for the entire society? So yeah, that's
very much. Very good. Just a word to the panel. I'm not going to get to rounds of answers. Keep all your answers for your final 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. All right, we have another question on this side.
Yeah, I didn't have a question. Ben, you forced me to ask a question. Yeah, Peter Jacobs from the Human Science Research Council. Thank you very much, Ben, and thanks for the overviews on these very important questions. The first one is that I've heard the concept, classical agrarian question being thrown around. I'd love to contest the very existence of such a thing as a classical agrarian question. I don't think there is such a thing as a classical agrarian question. If the classical agrarian question is associated with the so-called transition from some pre-capitalist formation to some capitalist formation, then why would we still be concerned with the agrarian question today, where we have capitalism in place? So therefore, that classical notion, or myth, as I prefer to call it, actually does not really exist. It was just a myth, I think, that some theorists who misread Lenin and Kautsky came up with. And I can go into deeper analysis of that. So that's the first thing. In addition to that, I think I've got the three simple, very basic questions. First is the Ghanaian situation of the fragile virtual liquidation of peasant activity in the 20s or 30s, and then some kind of regeneration, revival in the national liberation era. Maybe Kojo can just elaborate on how that particular process actually worked out and what was actually involved in that kind of transition. So I don't actually follow what happened between those two periods, because logically you would think that with the liquidation of the peasantry, which is what a lot of us sort of got used to here in South Africa, is that there is no way of how the peasant can be revived. The next point is on 2 or 3 issues of just the different usages of class structure and class composition in the countryside. It is very hard to get a sense of a consistent characterization of the class character of the countryside today. Are smallholders peasants? It seems to be that we are kind of getting lost in this kind of misclassification. Or do we call the agricultural proletariat or farm workers peasants? What is the current class structure in the countryside that can provide a basis for talking about the agrarian question today? Talking about the agrarian question simply by means of sectoral classifications I think it's rather also a misreading of Lenin. It was actually about the class structure and the importance of a certain layer of classes, both in the urban and in the countryside, in a transition against capitalism. And so therefore it goes back to the first issue. So this, I think it would be important for me, for the panel, to clarify that.
Peter, is that enough? Because we're running short of time.
Yeah, well, I've got, I haven't dealt with Professor Sivji's comments and remarks yet.
You're going to go on.
Yes, no, there is only,
You can save me.
there are only two questions for Professor Sivji. The first one is this, linking primitive accumulation as a kind of eating into consumption and reproduction is almost like saying, well, Marx missed out the fact that this thing is part of the logic of capitalism. It's inherent in the logic of capitalism for the capitalist to continuously try and lower the reproduction ability of the proletariat. It doesn't care actually about the proletariat, and so there is some inconsistency in your kind of saying, well, to rethink primitive accumulation as this aspect of transferring more of the reproduction cost to the labor. I don't think that is actually really anything new. And then the final part is on the question of alternatives. Both you and Ben all talk about alternatives. I think alternatives must be theorized at 3 or 4 different levels, starting with theoretical alternatives, and there I agree with you. I don't think theoretically we understand what we're actually dealing with in terms of the agrarian question today. Secondly, what kind of alternative organizational forms do we require? And thirdly, what alternative state? Because without an alternative state, the agrarian question cannot be resolved.
Thanks, Peter.
Okay, I think we're running short of time, so I'm going to ask the panel one by one if they will present their responses to these questions, but also to each other's presentations. There's no way of a 5-minute rounding up of the debate, as you now see it. Okay, so let's start with Kojo, Ruth, and Isa once again.
Okay, so I don't think I would agree that there was a liquidation of the peasantry in the 30s. But what essentially happened was a failure of industrial capitalist investments to take place. And what essentially happened were forms of merchant capital allied to agrarian import-export trade, which gave rise to forms of agribusiness accumulation, companies that transitioned into agribusiness accumulation. So there wasn't a dispossession, but rather an integration. And I think this continues to this day. So in many ways, the focus isn't on land grabbing, but it's on the grabbing of whole institutions involved in control of commodity trade and its regulation, of which probably the most spectacular example is what was called the Cocoa Wars in Côte d'Ivoire in the early 2000s, in which 4 multinationals captured the whole of the parastatal cocoa marketing services in the Ivory Coast. And by that, they dominated the whole cocoa trade in the world. So Cargill emerged then as a major, one of the top 4 cocoa traders in the world through that kind of activity. So, and that's a far more significant kind of grab than grabbing 5,000 hectares of land. You control, and it's also an act of grabbing a whole nation in a way. It's a control of the dominant economic sector in a nation through carrying that out. The other thing I'd like to comment on is this concept of medium-scale farmers being a recent phenomena. I don't think they're a new phenomena. They're something which emerged in the 70s, which then they were called large-scale farmers. And they're just the recomposition of that sector, and they bear all the similar class traits of those urban civil servants, urban-based traders. And so what we're seeing is not a new form of accumulation. It's the revival of forms which were established in the 70s. And I think that's one of the dangers of the literature on land grab. It presents this as a new thing, and as though before that we had no forms of accumulation, just peasant communitarian structure.
Thanks, Kojo. Ruth?
Great, thanks so much. There's a lot to respond to. Firstly, coming from a Southern African and South African perspective, I'm going to contest Professor Shivji's argument about the agrarian questions of capital and labour. And I would agree with comments about how we must see that if the classical agrarian question is about the establishment of a capitalist mode of production, this has been achieved. We have capitalist agriculture, world capitalism, and also in our case, we have resolved the agrarian question of capital within South Africa. And a classic way to see this is to look at the fact that, as we can say for the world as a whole, in South Africa we produce plenty of food for everyone to eat. Yet 54% of our population suffer from either chronic or acute food insecurity. So we have a problem, a distributional problem, but we have capitalist agriculture which is producing surpluses, and we have a crisis of social reproduction. And in response to this argument that, of course, the European path of development is not necessarily the model for an African one, I take the point. But I would emphasize that the European path had three things which Africa does not have. One is accumulation via slavery. Another is an industrial revolution to absorb surplus populations, or colonies to which to export surplus populations. So indeed, we need to be thinking of another pathway. I want to make an argument for 10 factors that need to be part of our thinking of shaping the agrarian question in African agriculture in the 21st century. And the first is the issue that was raised by one of the speakers from the floor, which is urbanization. I think it was Sia. That sub-Saharan Africa is the most rapidly urbanizing region of the world. Nearly 40% of the population is urbanized. In South Africa, it's over 60%. So what does this mean for the agrarian question? Interestingly, secondly, urban agriculture is growing alongside urbanization more generally. In fact, urban agricultural land is rising as a total percentage of all agricultural land. Thirdly, the land question, which we agree is part of the agrarian question. Well, we have the failure of land reforms to resolve questions of tenure and the status of customary rights. And we also have failed land redistribution programs in many of our country. And we see this push towards land titling, which I think is a problematic approach, a very big donor-supported push towards land certification. And we need to think about a policy mix for protective and defensive tenure reforms to strengthen land rights in the face of commoditization processes. A fourth theme is around employment and the kinds of agrarian labor that is being produced in the context of commercialization. And there's some very interesting work about this, including looking at the very limited potential of employment creation from large-scale agriculture, which often creates few jobs that are poor and insecure. Linked to that, fifthly, is what Henry Bernstein again calls fragmented classes of labor and the expansion of jobless and landless populations. And we see this very much in southern Africa, where there's been mass expulsion of farm workers and farm dwellers off farms. We also see a regional dynamic of migration across the region. And I think that one of the issues that arises for me, and again in response to Professor Shivji, is that your perspective about labor exploitation doesn't fully seem to capture what I see happening in the southern African region, which is that it's not that primitive accumulation is happening primarily through the appropriation of labor surpluses, but that we have a kind of situation similar to what Tanya Lee describes in Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia, which is a problem of where capital needs your land, but not your labor. And in fact, we have this chronic problem of unemployment, structural unemployment, where labor is surplus to the needs of capital, which raises profound questions as to livelihoods in southern Africa. Incidentally, I think that one of the features of agrarian dualism in a context of fragmented classes of labor is the function of social protection and agriculture as social protection and the role of social grants, because how would in a South African context, how would people survive without social grants? We are now in a context where this kind of model of agriculture is moving elsewhere, where there is no possibility of that. I want to agree with Kojo that what we see is not just grabbing of land, but importantly, the corporatization of value chains, and we should think about value chain grabbing. And here South African capital is a very significant actor elsewhere on the continent, where it's not just land, but often value chains in input industries, in processing, in supermarkets. This is where real value chain power is being cornered by South African capital and global capital. Second last point is about financialization. And two last points I think are underexplored. And perhaps these are sort of issues for us to think about in terms of future research directions. And the one is, what is the agrarian question in a context of profound climate change and ecological crisis? And this is not merely a question of the normal tropes of climate change mitigation and adaptation, climate smart agriculture. We really need to be fundamentally rethinking the industrial farming model and its significance on the continent. Secondly, we need to be thinking about the agrarian question in a context of rapidly changing technology. What are the technologies for securing land rights, for harvesting water, for predicting climate, for surplus labor? Thank you.
Yes, so
Okay.
we're actually right on 3, but people are hanging in because they're waiting on every word. But 5 minutes max, please.
Okay. Waiting on every word. I hope you do continue hanging and don't fall down. Alex, I think the first point that you made is extremely important, that the whole discussion, I would not say classical agrarian question, I would say classical writers on agrarian question, was about socialism. The major book by Lenin, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, was precise an argument against Narodniks, okay, who saw the possibility of moving to socialism, skipping capitalism. And he was saying no, because the debates were constructed at that time. Okay, socialism comes after capitalism, etc., etc. So I think you are right to remind us. Okay. All right. About super exploited, you are not sure. I'm a bit more sure than you, because I think if you go back to the debates of the 70s and 80s about unequal exchange, and unequal exchange not only in terms of trade, but also unequal exchange of labor values. Okay? If you take the classical theory about society and say labor time required to produce and so on and so forth. Okay? So there is, in my view, super exploitation. Okay? But we can discuss it. You get the example that actually the question is industrial question, not so much the agrarian question. And you get the example of China and in South Korea. Interesting, in both those countries, Industrial Revolution was preceded by fundamental land reform. Fundamental land reform, including South Korea. South Korea had a very fundamental land reform. Okay? And this was kind of necessary but not sufficient condition for Industrial Revolution. Okay. So I think we have to keep that in mind as well. Coming to about Fanon, speaking about peasant as the possible agency for revolution. Of course, Fanon also talked about lumpen proletariat. Where is my friend? Lumpen proletariat, right? As part of the agency of revolution. And I would say that we have had some discussions on this. And I have posited that in our current situation, what I would call the working people as the agency of the transformation. Okay. And working people would include your classical, traditional working class, which is very small in many countries. Okay. It would also include your so-called informal workers. Okay. It will include your peasantry, however big or small it is. It will also include your so-called lumpen proletariat. And I think one can argue, and I've argued before, shown why working people, all these groups of working people, the so-called fragmented working class, are part of the working people, and why they constitute the agency for transformation. Because all of them, if you now analyze the system of exploitation under neoliberalism, you'll find how all of them are yielding surplus to capital in one form or another, and subsidizing capital. Yes, what is the class character of the countryside? Of course, that's a fundamental question, very concrete question. I don't think you can give a across-the-board answer, because class character of the countryside differs from country to country and from time to time. So this is a task which faces us, undoubtedly so. Okay, to be able to get what are the classes in the countryside and what potential otherwise they have, etc., etc. You said that Marx always, of course, is always this cutting in necessary consumption, impoverishment of the proletariat, etc., which is true. But so is cheating. But Marx did not make cheating as part of his analysis of the mode of production. There was certain abstraction to construct this formula, which means that even if there was no cheating, okay, even if there was no cutting in necessary consumption, still there is exploitation. Okay. That doesn't mean that in concrete situation there is no cheating or there is no cutting in necessary consumption, there is no impoverishment. There is. Okay. But for purpose of analysis, to understand the capitalist mode of production, okay, Marx abstracted from that. Okay. He gave us a theory of mode of production, not a social formation. Yes, I totally agree with you. We cannot talk about transformation, and that is another very important issue before us, for those who want to bring about transformation. Organizational forms. Organizational forms. At one time we thought left parties, communist parties. Another time we thought national liberation movements. Okay, and we have to go back. And there was, of course, the theory of Vanguard Party, etc. But all this has to be revisited in the light of our concrete situations. Some organized form is very important. You have some new interesting examples, like for example that of Zapatista. Okay? So new forms of organization do emerge. The question is, how do you understand them and how do you make them develop? And that, again, in my view, is a concrete question. It will depend on particular circumstances and the balance of class power and class status in a particular country. Character of the state, I would do the same answer. Again, you're absolutely right. I totally agree with you. We have to analyze the character of the state and also the kind of state that you want to fight for change. Okay? The kind of state you want. And therefore, what kind of immediate demands you are going to make on the existing state with a view to move the struggle to a kind of state that you are envisaging. Right? So again, it's a very central question. Now, the question of Ruth, your response, thanks for it. In South Africa, we have solved the problem of, again, question of capital, because we have capitalist agriculture, which produces food which can feed the whole country, maybe the whole continent, I don't know. But the question is, it's not feeding. It's not feeding. Your people are malnourished, your people are impoverished, your people live in slums, okay? Why? What kind of capitalist agriculture you have which is not able to feed its people? That's the question we should ask, okay? That's the important question we should ask. How do you understand it analytically? And how do you theorize it? Why? Okay, I think I'll stop. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you all so much for attending and contributing to our lively debate.